Trainspotting, Cheech Chong, and addiction. Got the munchies? Grab some popcorn. Next on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Faith Saley. Today we're going to talk about addiction with Dr. Yasmin Hurd, professor of neuroscience, psychiatry, and pharmacological sciences at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and director of the Center for Addictive Disorders. Hello, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me here.
We're going to start with the sequel to Trainspotting.
Choose life. Choose Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and hope that someone, somewhere cares.
Based on the novel Porno by Irvine Welsh, the film follows Danny Boyle's 1996 flick Trainspotting and features the same cast of addicts as they move into the world of pornography. So early on in the first Trainspotting film, this character, Mark Renton, played by Ewan McGregor, drops a capsule of heroin into the filthiest toilet in all of the United Kingdom and then dives down into the filth to retrieve it. That is, honestly, that's about all I remember from my first viewing in 1996.
That is one of the most disturbing scenes in many movies. And I can't even look at it myself.
Is this typical behavior for an addict? Or a typical look at an addict's life?
It ranges. I mean, there are people, the one thing they have in common is that they will do anything to get that drug, to get that hit. Luckily, most people, or probably not luckily, most people don't go through those types of things in terms of the filth to get their heroin, but some do, and they will, like I said, they will go through anything just to get that hit. So I think in part it does represent what an addict, someone addicted to heroin will go through just to get it.
The characters in Trainspotting, they will give up anything for their addiction. How do drugs, hijack our natural sense of self-preservation?
The neurobiology of addiction is basically drugs tricking the brain into thinking that they've gotten something that was naturally rewarding. Our reward networks are activated, but they activated in such an extreme amount compared to natural rewards. And so that your brain says, I want that again and again and again because it's so intense that what the drugs do. So they completely hijack our reward system, especially in the beginning phases of going down that path for addiction. And so, most drugs of abuse mimics what our natural endogenous reward systems do and completely hijacks them.
Can drugs irrevocably hijack our reward system so that our brains and our bodies can never quite recover?
From a lot of the research that we see, it does appear that once you have gone down a path for a very long time, it takes a very long time for your reward system to get back to normal if it ever does. So, the adage that people say all the time, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic, in part that's true. The memories that are there associated in your neural networks that contain those memories and the reward pathways that are altered, they're there for a long while. So even if you haven't taken the drug, those parts of your brain are still sensitive to the cues that would initiate the memories and therefore the craving and the drive to get the drugs. And if you ever relapse, your brain remembers it in a way that a person who had never seen the drug would not respond to it in the same way. So yes, there are fundamental changes that the drugs take over your natural reward networks and your natural cognitive networks that maintain normal behavior in part. So clearly there's a hijacking.
And are people who become addicts more wired to receive some kind of a bigger reward?
You ask an interesting question because in part there's a chicken and egg phenomenon with addiction because there are people who clearly were vulnerable to becoming addicted because their brains were a little bit different, either because of environmental stresses and traumas early in life, genetics that they inherited of vulnerable genes, a number of things that increases your vulnerability, so that their brains are different the first time they've ever taken a drug. And they could take the same drug as many of their friends who go on and never have a problem, but the first time they take it, they have a completely different response. It's like, wow. And then the opposite, you have that people who did not have a vulnerability per se, but repeatedly take the drug. Why? They're at a party, they get a drug, then the next party, and so on. And for certain drugs, no matter even if you don't have a vulnerability, if you keep taking the drug, you're changing your brain.
Yeah.
So yes, it's both that happens. Once your brain becomes dependent on this drug, it's different from when you first took the drug, and it will respond differently.
In one particularly horrific turn of events in Trainspotting, the junkies allow their child to die. Mm. And, as a parent, it's, the urge to protect, the need to protect your child is so fundamental and ingrained that I wonder, how does a narcotic overwhelm such a primal need?
So you said it, and exactly that. The drug has replaced the primal need. So
it is the primal need.
It is the primal need. So, in our life, we have priorities of what's important and the value and the reward that we get for you, your kids, our relationships with our families and our friends, our job. The drug for an addicted person completely jumps over all those other priorities. That is the essence for their survival. That is the essence for their being. Seeking the drug, taking the drug, it completely takes away every other priority in their lives. And that's why addiction is so difficult to treat, so difficult to beat, that it's trying to tell someone you can't eat anymore when you need food to survive. For them, the drug is survival. So it's no longer their child, even though they love their children. It's not about not understanding and loving and wanting the other things in their lives. It's just that the drug completely takes over.
The sequel to Trainspotting is being kept very hush-hush, but we know from the book that the characters all cross paths again in the porn industry, and Sick Boy, played once again by Johnny Lee Miller, has moved from heroin to crack. Is there a big difference between heroin and crack?
They're different in the type of class of drugs. So heroin is an opioid. Crack, obviously, crack cocaine is a psychostimulant. And they have different mechanism of action because pharmacologically, heroin binds to its endogenous receptor called the mu-opioid receptors or opioid receptors. And heroin, in cocaine, it elevates dopamine by inhibiting the transport of dopamine back into neurons. Both of them, though, have in common that they increase dopamine, as most drugs of abuse increase this reward transmitter. And so they have a very similar effect on the brain. So crack cocaine also hits the brain quickly, leaves the brain quickly.
How quickly?
You're talking about seconds. You're talking about getting into the brain that quickly, the peak effects within minutes. And so this is why they're very addictive.
And then the high leaves how quickly?
The high will depend on the type of psychostimulant or heroin. So you peak high, it's like 30 minutes. It's not that these drugs, depending on the drug class, the high can be mellow and the dose that they've taken, and it can either be, like 30 minutes, and some highs for different drugs, like the marijuana, more of this mellow feeling and good feeling for an hour. So the class of drugs will determine the type of high that one gets.
There's something so sad about how quick the high is, how much people give up for so little.
Yeah.
Which is so much to them.
Right, and that's why, the goal, the drive to get that back again is part of that drug-seeking behavior. When it lasts that long, when it's so short, I should say, you even wanted it more and more. There's something, really powerful about that.
It's like the drug playing hard to get.
Exactly.
You want it more.
Right, exactly. That's perfect.
Now, in Trainspotting, the characters are all in the porn industry. And I don't know. There seem to be, you mentioned the heroin user who says it's like 1,000 orgasms. There's this kind of relationship from the high you can get from well, sex and porn are two different things.
Right.
But we do hear a lot about the dangers of porn addiction. And do you think porn and narcotics are similar? Do they work similarly in our brains?
I mean, there are fundamental differences between, and I'm going to for porn, we're talking about sex in one way as a start, and sex is a natural reward. We need it for it to be pleasurable for our species to survive, or else it wouldn't. So, but porn, it's an excessive compulsive sex or looking at sex. And a lot of the studies that have gone on, there are still not that many to look at what happens in the brain, but you do see that there are similar reward circuits that are activated as you see with substance users. So for example, that transmitter dopamine that I talked about, that many people know when they think about reward transmitter. Actually, for people who are porn abusers, their dopamine system looks like you would see in a drug addict. So there's some definite similarities, and also the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that's important for inhibitory control, that's also looks like a lot of people who do drugs. So there are definitely similarities. The drugs, though, as I said, those are really powerful pharmacological agents, so they have definitely a very powerful effect on these neural circuits, perhaps than porn does. But they definitely recruit similar networks, which is intriguing. But at the end of the day, we have to remember our brain it's the same pathway for mediating certain things. When you look at your child and playing with your child and you're happy, it is your natural reward circuits that are being activated as well. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that we see that there are similar networks that are altered in people who are porn addicts compared to those who are drug addicts.
From Cheech Chong to Pineapple Express, the stoner movie has shown us a huge cast of lost but affable pot smokers stumbling through life. Cinematic pot smokers are such, fun, charming, stupid guys. And they're guys. They're mostly guys.
That's true.
Is that statistically correct? Are most pot smokers in real life dudes?
Yeah, they are. However, in really most substances of abuse, males abuse more than women. And I think that there is a social society aspect to that we can come back to if you're interested. But I think that the female brain is very sensitive to drugs. So it's a good thing that we're probably a little smarter, that we don't try the drugs as much as the guys do. Perhaps they're more riskier in their behavior, and so they get into the addiction. But you do definitely see a larger number of girls smoking marijuana than you had in the past. So, in coming years, those numbers might change, but for now, there are definitely more guys that smoke marijuana than girls or than women. But younger populations, you're seeing more females.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's just our society. Like you said, the movies, they're fun, and our society today, we're having these huge debates about the legalization of marijuana. So I think it's a lot of teens today don't think that marijuana is that risky. In fact, more teens today think that cigarette smoking is worse for you than smoking marijuana.
Is that true?
For certain things, absolutely. Tobacco, the lung cancer, all of the things that we've educated our population to say this is not healthy. We still don't know the full extent of marijuana's impact on health. There's just not that much research. Ironically, we think that there's a lot of research on marijuana because it's been around for so long, but we don't even have, not even a quarter as much research done on marijuana as we do for cigarettes or alcohol. But, the developing brain reacts very differently to marijuana, the long-term impact, than it does to the adult brain. So we do know that from our animal models and looking epidemiologically in human populations. So I would still say to the teens that yes, cigarettes are bad for you, but marijuana in the developing brain is equally has some negative effects that we know has long-term impact. So I wouldn't say that, yes, it's fine just because, tobacco, you can get lung cancer more than you would with, say, marijuana. So I think I would give them I would say that both have issues that they should be aware of.
What does THC do to a younger brain?
So THC, the psychoactive compound of marijuana, for example, it will, in an adolescent brain, it has a much bigger impact on that reward network, as we were talking about earlier, than it does on an adult brain. And for us, more importantly, this whole controversial issue of gateway, is marijuana a gateway drug? When you give it a developing adolescent brain THC and you look at them when they're adults, they show much greater sensitivity to other drugs of abuse. If they're given access to, say, choose that drug, they will choose that drug, whether heroin, for example, much more than a normal control a normal control animal in terms of animal experiments. While if you give the same THC to an adult, their brain doesn't show that great sensitivity and that sensitization as much as an adolescent brain. So we know that there's something about the developing brain with marijuana that has a much longer impact that we don't see in the adult brain. And remember, one of the things about the adolescent brain, it's the prefrontal cortex also is still developing a lot. In fact, our prefrontal cortex doesn't fully achieve maturity until their mid-20s. So you can tell your kids they have a long time to go. So that perhaps may be one of the reasons why marijuana during adolescence we see much greater effects than we see in a fully adult brain.
Since 1990, marijuana has been scheduled as a class 1 substance. What does a schedule of substances mean?
It's a categorization of drugs that might have abuse potential. So they're categorized from Schedule 1 to Schedule 5. Schedule 1 being drugs that have the highest abuse potential and have no medicinal value, that there's no medical value established as yet.
That's Schedule 1?
Yes.
Okay.
So that, and to be honest, marijuana, there's, like I said, the catch-22 of it all is we haven't done that much research, so it's not used, it's not established for medical use.
Why is medical marijuana legal in some states?
Because of our society thinking that because it's just like nicotine and alcohol, so why is it banned? And that the government has scared us with a lot of propaganda in the past that marijuana you would jump off buildings and it was like a narcotic. So I think that people are wary of why is it a Schedule 1 drug, but they've failed to realize that the Schedule 1 terminology was set for it had to have some sort of established medicinal value. And right now there are studies going on, but people think that marijuana can cure this and cure that, but it's never been proven. Ironically, in our own research, we're studying a particular component of the marijuana plant, cannabidiol, for seeing if it can help against heroin craving and seeking behavior. And it's been interesting, the results. So there were coming, but there's nothing established on marijuana. So that's why it's Schedule 1.
Should it be Schedule 1? Do you think that's the right place for pot?
If we keep that definition for Schedule 1, yes. Is it as abusive? Does it have the abuse potential as heroin, which is also Schedule 1? No. And it doesn't produce the mortality as heroin. So if the categorizations change, it should not be Schedule 1. And perhaps, and this is another thing I think that people fail to remember, marijuana is a plant that has many chemicals. So there's a difference if we say, should THC be Schedule 1 or cannabidiol and other cannabinoids in marijuana be scheduled? Because cannabidiol does not have any abuse potential that we've seen. So that perhaps should be taken out of Schedule 1. So if you break up marijuana, the components of marijuana, that's how you get around it. But the plant itself is kind of tough to even give medicinally. There are a lot of nuances with, telling someone smoke this, for medicinal value.
So just so I understand you, Schedule 1 is a substance that has very high potential to be addictive?
Yes.
And you said that includes, Schedule 1 includes cigarettes?
No.
No?
Heroin, LSD, and marijuana, for
And
example.
But so this is blowing my mind because marijuana is becoming legal in more and more places.
Yeah.
LSD is not. Heroin is not.
No, exactly.
So just so I understand, for point of reference, what's Schedule 5? Give me an example of some of the Schedule 5.
Some of the, say...
Reality shows?
Exactly. It's good. So some of the some prescription medications that are opiates that might have long-lasting effects that are very controlled and low abuse potential are
fairly
scheduled.
benign. Okay.
Yeah. But the reason that I think marijuana has become this anomaly is because it's, movies have made it into this. It's the fun guys.
Yeah.
It's but it started from then the reefer madness that I saw before, that the government had this whole thing of reefer madness, which, yes, a subset of people, a small subset, are much more vulnerable to that.
Paranoia kind
yes,
of, yeah.
absolutely.
So you think it was backlash that
exactly.
all these movies came out where, hey, it's just people having a good
exactly.
time.
And then, in the 60s, 70s, the peace, love, flower generation started smoking marijuana and realized, wait, we're not all jumping out of buildings.
Right.
Hey, wait, we're not all transitioning to heroin. So there are subsets of people who are absolutely much more vulnerable to marijuana abuse and the things that go along with it, perhaps also the gateway. There's definitely potential for that. But it is not as dangerous a drug as heroin, but it has significant impact on the developing brain. So I think we are in a time in our society where we need more research. Unfortunately, we're now having citizens decide and vote whether something should be legal, while we've never had that for any other drug. So
and uninformed citizens.
Because
if you're informed
exactly.
by watching Pineapple Express, you're not really informed.
Right, and so you can't convince some people that marijuana is not this ideal drug, and there are components of it, as I said, that definitely has medicinal value, but it has to be established. Once established, we might change the schedule. But for certain groups, it's as bad in some ways as heroin, because it does take away their potential in life, because they do nothing else except for that drug. So
how do you feel as a doctor who treats people with addictions when you see how prevalent and ubiquitous these benign portrayals of potheads are, especially geared towards young audiences?
So I think it's more, again, it comes back to the issue of being informed. And I think that movies are made to entertain, and they entertain in different ways. So, the movies that you discussed, a lot of those are the fun movies and the comedies. And often comedies is marijuana. When you look at the more serious movies, it's the heroin. I think Hollywood needs to give that whole thing of following some kids with marijuana. I can, introduce them to parents whose children started early and have gone down a different path than the bumbling, fun-loving and so cute Cheech Chong. And they do need to give the public that whole wide barrage. So we go to the heroin abusers, but there are a lot of people who are dependent on marijuana who don't live great lives, who have mental illness. And so there needs to be some equal parity in Hollywood. It won't happen.
I know, I'm laughing because I'm thinking, which kind of serious director? Is Darren Aronofsky going to do a pot film about someone,
It's also marijuana. A lot of artists use marijuana for creativity.
Yeah.
So again, I think that, is there something wrong with that? Probably not. Their lives are controlled. They are productive citizens. And as I said, for me, the adult brain is one thing. The developing brain, adolescent brain is another. And as I said, there are parts of the marijuana plant that we're even developing ourselves for medicinal, to see whether or not it can have medicinal value. And those we would like to make sure that are available for people to be treated with.
If you had to pitch the story for a movie that would be a realistic movie about what it's like to be a drug addict, like this is what happens and this is the realistic end, and from what you've seen in your career, what would it be? Happy ending, devastating ending, what would it be?
I would have a family where you follow the children, and the family has a history. It's hidden by one family member, and so the kids don't know in part. And you follow the kids as they navigate their different paths. And one is a happy ending and the other isn't. They both undergo addiction. And so it comes back to one was lucky and one wasn't. And that to me perhaps is some of the realities that exists.
Is that a lesson that you've learned from working with people with addiction? Sometimes it's a matter of luck.
It's a matter of luck, it's a matter of resources, but sometimes even if you're the richest person in New York City, your child still dies of heroin overdose. And that's the reality. That's the reality.
Thank you. That's about all we have time for.
Thank you.
Whatever we can't fit into this half hour, we'll share on our Science Goes to the Movies Facebook page. And if you want to watch past episodes, check us out at www.cunytv under the Science tab.